Asia Times, 16th of August 2022, why does Australia risk a war with China instead of caving into Chinese demands? Australia wants to be ready to face China after remembering how close the Japanese were during World War II. Australia has the same right as all other nations to have a military presence in the South China Sea. However, how and why it uses that right has become a crucial policy issue. In support of the US policy to limit China, should Australia risk kinetic conflict with China by allowing aircraft intelligence investigations around its coast and potential freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs, to question its maritime claims? Why, if so? Renowned Australian analyst Rory Medcalf has summed Australia's interests in the South China Sea as rules, balance, and lifelines. Australia is a major trading nation, a maritime actor in regional international law, a middle power that benefits from the preservation of norms in international law, a partner to its Asian neighbours, and an ally of the US, according to him. Let's evaluate these arguments and determine which, alone or collectively, are likely enough to warrant the danger of political, economic, and military conflict with China. First, just 20% of Australian exports go through the South China Sea. Most of these go to China and are unlikely to be stopped by Beijing during times of peace. China has not yet threatened the freedom of commercial navigation because the US conflates the freedom of commercial navigation, the notion that it does or could arise. As she has repeatedly demonstrated, China will lie to you until nothing can be done to change the status quo. One example is China's militarized artificial islands built in the South China Sea. In China, some of these later activities breach the obligation outlined in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to appropriately consider its rights and interests in its exclusive economic zone, EEZ. The Chinese 9-dash line demonstrates that China does not adhere to international norms. Despite not having ratified UNCLOS, the US nonetheless applies its interpretations of it. Is it worth it for Australia to risk a military clash with China over this politicized and confused US principle? Australia, according to Medcalf, is a middle power and a friend of the US. However, it is the issue. Australia, a sole central authority, is endangering China, a great power, in supporting its ally, the US. The suggestion that Australia is there to show its support for norms and international law is when Medcalf's logic runs off the tracks. China gives it lip service. The UNCLOS, which it is using to bolster its presence in the South China Sea, has not been approved by its partner, the US, who it supports and assists there. Australia is also far from being a model of adherence to the international community's rules. It contravenes UNCLOS by claiming an exclusive economic zone, EEZ, over the Heard and McDonald Rocks and requiring foreign vessels transiting the Torres Strait to have pilotage. However, Australia's conduct in its maritime border dispute with Timor-Leste is the most embarrassing. Yet in the height of hypocrisy, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Australian Ambassador to the Philippines Stephen Robinson urged adherence to UNCLOS, saying that respect for international laws, particularly UNCLOS, is important to peace, prosperity, and stability in the area. Although that statement was directed at China, it applies to the US and Australia. Finally, Medcalf mentions Australia's cooperation with its neighbours in Asia. The Australian Defence Department stated that it has for decades done maritime surveillance missions in the region in response to the recent risky incident involving Chinese and Australian jets near the China-held Paracel Islands. The five-power defence arrangement was the first justification for Australian ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, planes to be present over the South China Sea, FPDA. But this agreement, intended initially to defend Malaysia and Singapore when the British left the area, has changed to back the US's efforts to limit China. This Cold War pact from 1971 between Australia, the UK, New Zealand, Malaysia, and Singapore also only calls for consulting in the event or threat of an armed assault on any side. No direct military intervention is promised. Australia is in charge of the FPDA's integrated air defence system for Malaysia and Singapore, situated in Butterworth, Malaysia. While most drills occur in the South China Sea, some have also been conducted off the shores of Malaysia and Singapore. However, Malaysia's EEZ claim ends far from the coast of China. Chinese EEZ, however, is inside of the economic zones of Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. The FPDA does not justify Australia's intelligence-gathering flights along China's coast. Additionally, Australian Poseidon P-8s fly over the South China Sea from Singapore. Brunei, Manila, and Darwin. These flights might be conducted by the contentious Five Eyes (FVEY) arrangement. This alliance, which includes the US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, focuses on exchanging signals intelligence. It began as an anti-Soviet movement and is currently an aggressive Chinese effort, but it has substantially increased its defensive capabilities. If this is the rationale for Australian ISR investigations into China's defences, Canberra would want to rethink its desire to continue acting as a US proxy in this operation. It is true that AUKUS, the deal to provide Australia access to nuclear submarine and underwater drone technologies, will eventually establish Australia as a significant player and combine its fleet with US's in South China Sea operations. However, that is a partner in China's US containment plan. However, in self-defense, the regional nations have not requested this. Indeed, the Chinese oppose the AUKUS because they regard it as the start of rebelling against them. The next move for Australia might be to launch FONOPs in opposition to China's claims, either by itself or in partnership with the US. Australia has so far refused to do this despite significant pressure from the US. It is for valid reasons. Conflict could result from doing so. This would be the height of ally support, sacrificing oneself and one's people. Supporting allies in a conflict is one thing. But to aid in starting a match that will be one of the first casualties is quite different. But it's possible that the Australian populace is unaware that their government is jeopardizing their welfare in order to back the US containment policy. Australia is determined to poke China in the eye, notwithstanding the repercussions. According to Australian Defence Minister Richard Marles, our national interest is in what are the rules of the road, the global rules-based order, in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. He declared that Australia would keep its ISR investigations in the South China Sea. Australia is determined to poke China in the eye notwithstanding the repercussions. It may want to think about how it would respond if Chinese ISR aircraft patrolled near its shore, probing its defenses and dropping sonobuoys to find its submarine. For example, in May, the Chinese intelligence-gathering ship off the coast of Exmouth Naval Base was referred to as aggressive conduct by the then Defence Minister Peter Dutton. Dangerousness is rising in the situation. There was optimism that the incoming Labour administration under Prime Minister Anthony Albanese would approach relations with China with more reason and perspective. But it has already aroused China's wrath by openly condemning Beijing's response to US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's recent trip to Taiwan. The Albanian administration faces essential issues due to this catastrophic circumstance. In this game of military chicken in the South China Sea, how far should Australia go on the side of the US? Australia might be unwittingly escalating tensions with China in the South China Sea. The government needs to be honest with the public about the dangers Australia faces and the rationale behind sending people into waters so far from its borders. Australia's proactive defence against China's growing threat is commendable.